parenting is a lot like the Christian life. There are significant challenges, struggles, moments where you're just sort of banging your head against a wall. I can remember, actually, I don't cry very much. Cry more than Mr. Norwood. I'm right there with him, though. But actually, this summer, there was a moment where we were really struggling with one of our children, and I just started crying. I mean, I was just sort of overwhelmed with the challenge, really. And Sarah and I kind of shared just our frustrations, and it's just difficult. But then on the other hand, there are these deep joys. I mean, this is a Christian life. It's filled with challenges and struggles and suffering, as well as deep joys. And so I hope that we see that. One thing I hope that happens over the course of these sessions is that we're able to step back from kind of the nitty-gritty and broaden our horizons for what exactly we're doing as parents. Because what we're doing in these little moments will have an impact 5,000 years from now. And I want us to kind of see that. But before we do that, the focus of this session is just looking at the importance of this concept of little church. Its importance. And before we even go there, we kind of need to explain a little bit what we're talking about when we talk about little church. We talked about big church a lot growing up when I was little. We never talked about little church. So what is this idea? Let's let Jonathan Edwards speak to the matter. Jonathan Edwards was an American theologian, a New England Puritan, probably the greatest theologian America has ever seen, a pastor. And his last sermon to his congregation at the Northampton church that he served for many years, this is an excerpt from that final sermon that he gives. It's kind of like his if I could, the last lecture, kind of the most important thing I could say, I'm saying it now. And here's part of what he says. Let me now, therefore, once more, before I finally cease to speak to this congregation, repeat and earnestly press the counsel which I have often urged on the heads of families while I was their pastor, to great painfulness in teaching, warning, and directing their children, bringing them up in the training and admonition of the Lord, beginning early where there is yet opportunity, and maintaining constant vigilance in all labors of this kind. Every Christian family ought to be, as it were, a little church, consecrated to Christ, wholly influenced and governed by his rules. And family education and order are some of the chief means of grace. This is important. If these fail, all other means are likely to prove ineffectual. Constant diligence in laboring to this end of having a home that is consecrated to Christ. It's a little church. And by doing so, he says, it's a chief means of grace in the salvation of the next generation. Richard Baxter, who was an English Puritan in England, I think he's about a century before Edwards, he says, you are not likely to see any general reformation till you procure family reformation. Some little religion there may be here and there, but while it is confined to single persons and is not promoted in families, it will not prosper nor promise much future increase. It doesn't use the word little church, but the idea is certainly there, right? The family is such an important institution for fostering the faith, developing the faith. Let's go on to the next one. Crossing the Tiber. We're going to look at a quote from a Catholic, Pope Benedict. He says, the family is fundamental because it is the place where there germinates in the human soul the first perception of the meaning of life. This perception grows in the relationship with the mother and with the father, who are not the owners of the life of the child, but the first collaborators with God in the transmission of life and the faith. It's a great excerpt. One thing I love about it is that, back to the control, we're not the owners of these children. Paul Tripp, he has a book that just came out on parenting, and one of the things he stresses in that book is that we're ambassadors. They belong to God. We're simply God's instruments to serve them well and love them well. So, this concept of little church is an important concept. Whether you're Protestant, Catholic, whether you are, across the span of church history, the concept is there. It's crucial to the church, and it's also biblical. It's also biblical, and we're gonna look at that more in a moment, and especially tomorrow. And then finally, as we probably realized as we started thinking about the challenges that we face as parents, it's difficult. It's difficult. What I want to do now, it's particularly difficult in our own age, okay, in our own culture. And what I want to do is highlight two of the difficulties that we face in cultivating little churches, okay? Challenges to little church, two of them. One is a diminished parental authority and influence in our own day. The second is our obsession with living in the now. As I was writing that, I was hearing Garth Algar correct Wayne of Wayne's World when he's looking at this guitar, coveting this guitar, and Garth yells at him from the Mirthmobile, "Live in the now." And now I'm not saying, what I'm saying is we need to step up out of the now. But we'll get there. Let's look at diminished parental authority and influence. In 1837, Hans Christian Andersen wrote a story called The Little Mermaid. You see, you've got a picture of kind of more from the era of the original, and then of course we have Disney there on the right side. I think this story and what has happened to this story really kind of illustrates what I'm talking about when I talk about the diminished parental authority that we have. So let me explain the story. Just until the last couple of years, I was not familiar with The Little Mermaid, the original. Familiar with the Disney version, but not the original. Let me share with you what happens in that story. There's some similarities, of course, but not too many. In Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid, a young, beautiful, but melancholy mermaid princess, swims to the surface of the water. She's not supposed to. She hears merriment, singing, dancing, and she looks and she sees this dashing, handsome prince. She longs for this prince. She scurries back into the water. She's just sort of overwhelmed, smitten by what she sees on the boat. She goes and she talks to her grandmother, and she says that she loves this prince. And her grandmother is very caring, very sensitive to the Little Mermaid's kind of crush. She says very kindly, no matter how beautiful a mermaid is from the waist up, humans consider fishtails quite ugly. And her grandma basically says, no, you can't do that. It's not a good idea. And then the text tells us that the Little Mermaid, overwhelmed with youthful passion, forsakes kindred and home, rejects her grandmother's advice, rejects her family, rejects her community, and off she goes to the sea witch, who can make her a human, but it's going to come at a great cost. She loses her voice, and this voice is so beautiful and great. She loses that. She feels pain. Every time she takes a step, it feels as though knives are shooting up her body. She's going to experience this awful pain. And so she meets with this beautiful prince. She gets connected to him. They actually become close friends. She serves the prince, and he loves her friendship, but she can't talk. And he's been smitten by this person with this wonderful voice. I forgot to mention, she saves him. This is kind of like a Disney story. She saves him, sings, and he's just like, there's this beautiful person that has this lovely voice. It's not you, because you can't sing. And he ends up marrying another lady. Now, the sea witch said, if you can't win the love of the prince, you die. And so Little Mermaid's about to die because the wedding day happens. They get married. The prince and the other princess get married. The Little Mermaid just kind of standing watching. But she gets a shot. She gets a shot to return back to being a mermaid. She has to kill the prince. She has a knife and she can go kill him. She walks into the bedroom where the prince and princess are fast asleep together. She can't do it. And sure enough, she turns to sea foam. That's the end of the story. That's it. Big mistake. Now, Disney's story is so different than that. I mean, it's like complete opposite. In the Disney version, the little Ariel, the Little Mermaid, she longs to live with the humans, and she sees this beautiful Eric, this prince, and her hopes are sternly dashed by her father, King Triton, who says, as long as you live under my ocean, you'll obey my rules. And despite Sebastian, the Little Mermaid's little crab chaperone, his best attempts to keep her under the sea, Ariel pursues her options with this sea witch. Now, so here's some of the key differences. And we know that, and actually, if you haven't seen I'm kind of assuming everybody's seen the Disney cartoon, but she meets Eric, they fall in love, they get married. Let's just look at kind of some of the differences between these two stories. And whereas Anderson presents the Little Mermaid's grandmother and family as wise, caring, sacrificial, and in the end, right. And by the way, her family is about to they almost make a huge sacrifice to get her back to them, to bring her back. And she rejects it. So they're sacrificial. And in the end, her family was right. It was not a good idea to follow her youthful passion. Well, in the Disney version, they present Ariel's father as angry, unreasonable, oppressive, and in the end, wrong. And if you remember King Triton at the end, he's talking to Sebastian. He says, I guess I was wrong. He comes around. I was too harsh on her. I was wrong, and poor me. I've learned something now. So father's kind of enlightened. So Anderson portrays the Little Mermaid's rebellion against her family and people as misguided and tragically destructive. Completely destroys her life and kills her family and her community. Breaks their heart. Disney presents Ariel's rebellion from her family as the pathway to her personal fulfillment, and the means by which is enlightened. It's making the complete opposite point. So the Disney version, in complete contrast to the Anderson's version, casts doubt over the wisdom and motives of parental and familial authority. And Disney's not alone. I mean, there's a host of contemporary stories and movies and shows that portray parents as, at best, just sort of out of touch, and at worst, the antagonist standing in the way of the child's dream. We could do so many comparisons of these fairy tales. These older stories have such a rich view of parents. And we're left with, Homer Simpson. If I think of a model dad, for kind of our era, Homer Simpson's the guy that comes to my mind. Not an exemplar of sacrificial, wise parenting. And really underneath this, the tectonic plates that are shifting underneath all of this are related to our view of authority. And I know you guys are going through Exodus right now, and I've listened to some of the sermons, actually. And I can remember Justin describing just the idea of authority in the book of Exodus being very important. In the first chapter, the Hebrew word abad, which means to slave or to serve a master, is used throughout the first chapter. I mean, almost in an obnoxious way. And the author is saying the people are enslaved in Egypt, and it's awful. And reading that, you think, okay, so the book of Exodus is about to move from slavery, enslavement, to freedom. But that's actually not what it is. Because when Moses is with God at the burning bush, he says, if Pharaoh asks me, why am I to let them leave? He says, what should I say to them? And this is what Yahweh's reply is. Tell them that they must come abad me, right? They're leaving the abad, the enslavement and servitude of the Egyptians, and they're going to come and they're going to be my people. So the book of Exodus is not the move from slavery to freedom. It's the move from bad servitude, bad authority, to good authority and to good service, the kind that makes us flourish. I mean, there's so many ways in which authority is just a beautiful thing. Let me try to demonstrate it, because it's counterintuitive. Every one of our modern myths is built on the premise that authority is bad. And the Christian faith says authority is good. Authority leads to flourishing. Let me try to give you some practical examples of this. We were just talking about Kevin Durant and LeBron James. Those guys can play basketball, obviously. They're some of the top talent in all the world. They can play. When they're on the court, they're playing freely. They're playing creatively. They can do that because they've submitted themselves to the rules of basketball, to the fundamentals of basketball. They've submitted themselves to their coach's instruction and coaches that they've had over the course of their career. They've submitted themselves to the rules of the game. It's so painful to watch 4-year-olds play anything sports-related because there's no submission to any authority at all. It's just every man does what they want. It's just a mess. See, authority makes the game flourish, and it makes the individual, to the extent that they submit themselves to the authority of the game, they flourish. They flourish. The jazz pianist, she can play creatively and freely only after she has submitted herself to theory and to the rules of the piano. A 2-year-old that begins to talk, no matter how rebellious they might seem, when they start speaking that English language, they're submitting themselves to the rules of English language. If they don't do that, they make absolutely no sense at all. They're combining subjects and predicates and verbs, and they're putting all of these sentences together. And as a result of that, they begin to flourish in a way that they did not flourish before they learned the language. They can now ask for a drink when they're thirsty instead of just scream. And we're all sort of, what is going on? They can ask for a snack. See, this principle is all over the universe. This principle that by submitting ourselves to authority, we find freedom and we flourish. And I think it's important that we sort of restore that and that we cast that vision as we think about our role as parents. Yeah, despite the effort, despite a culture that is collectively suppressing the influence of parents, there are still some encouraging signs that suggest that parents are a huge influence in their children's life, particularly when it comes to spiritual matters. Christian Smith wrote a book in 2005 called Soul Searching, and he was looking at the religious and spiritual lives of American teenagers. And what he found is that whether you're Buddhist, Muslim, Baptist, Catholic, Mormon, whatever faith background, the role of the parent in shaping the outlook of the teenagers on spiritual things is huge. Huge. Here's some of his conclusions. The evidence clearly shows that the single most important social influence on the religious and spiritual lives of adolescents is their parents. The best social predictor, although not a guarantee, of what the religious and spiritual lives of youth will look like is what the religious and spiritual lives of their parents do look like. This recognition may be empowering to parents or alarming or both, but it is a fact worth taking seriously in any case. Nominal Christian, most likely the children will turn out nominal. You know, just kind of Christian in name only, maybe attend a couple times a year, that sort of thing. Devout, faithful, devoted, serious, chances are that'll translate to children that take the faith seriously and that sort of thing. Okay, so that's first challenge. Challenge number 2. Living in the now. And I have in parentheses presentism. just being in the present, being locked in on the present. There's this story about a college at Oxford called New College. So the British university system, you become a member of the university, and you also become a member of a college. And within the university, there's all of these different colleges. New College is one of those colleges at Oxford. It was built in the 1300s. And the dining hall, which you can sort of see there, above the ceiling, there's this beautiful oak beams that just lace the ceiling of New College. It was built in the 1300s. 500 years later, in the mid-1800s, those wooden beams begin to rot, and they need to be replaced. And the college council begins looking all over England for suitable replacements, and they cannot find them. And so they shift their search to the continent of Europe. They still have no luck. They look to the Americas, no luck. As they're doing this search, a fellow at the college, basically a student, stumbles upon the original plans for the college. And within those plans, he sees some notes related to these wooden beams. So the council takes a look they unfurl the plans, and they take a look at it. And it says that they actually had planted oak trees to serve as replacements for those that were in there, the originals. And they look up, as the story goes, they look up and look out the window, and sure enough, they see the forest, the oak forest, where these trees were just stone's throw from where they were. Now, that is remarkable foresight. I mean, these developers anticipated a problem that would not arise for 500 years. And in order to do that, you have to have a pretty unique relationship to time. Your sense of time needs to be fairly broad. Strangely, we are the most time-conscious people ever. We have all sorts of devices that tell us what time it is, and bank marquees, and our days are so precisely measured throughout the day. And given that situation, that sort of constricts our world. And we begin to live our lives, our daily lives, like Jack Bauer, feeling kind of the punch of each second gone. And it constricts our view of life. I mean, we can't remember, it's hard for us to remember what we did last weekend, much less think about what the future might hold 100 years down for our great-grandchildren. We can't get outside of that. So our own age tells us that everything that is now is what matters. Seize the day. Our local news station, their little catchphrase or whatever, is live, local, late-breaking. 24-hour news contributes to this. Everything seems so important that's happening right now. And the information deluge that we get, we're just flooded by information. That sort of locks us in on the present as well. Well, that's not the Bible's view of time. It's not the Bible's view of time. And in order to see that, I want us to look at Psalm 78. Psalm 78, this is verses 1 through 7. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord, and his might, and the wonders that he has done. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. As we read Scripture, it's very tempting for us to read, my Bible to see what God has to say to me personally. And that's not entirely wrong, but we have to remember that the Bible was written to a community of faith, that the yous that we read in the Bible are typically plural use more than they're singular, right? That's speaking to a community. And that is true here in this text. I mean, what strikes you about this text? Anything stand out? I've underlined some things so that might clue you into something. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. How many generations do you think are in view here? Yeah? At least 3. I would say probably 4. Yeah, maybe 4. At least 3. You can kind of read it a couple different ways. But the point is, broad horizon, right? I mean, how you read that and you think, well, how often do I pray for my grandchildren that have yet to my great grandchildren, just posterity in general? Like that's the biblical view has that sort of scope in mind. The Bible is asking us to think more like the developers of New College, to think big picture. If we are to establish little churches, we must get up out of this present obsessed age in which we live and begin thinking about not just our own children, but even our posterity, those following our children. That's where your biggest impact will be. Jonathan Edwards, I mentioned Jonathan. He had lots of children, 14, I believe. Noel Piper, John Piper's wife, wrote some about some of these children. I'm gonna read that now. She says, beginning, and she's talking more about Jonathan's wife, Sarah. She says, beginning on August 25th, 1728, children came into the family. Oh, no, not 14, 11 in all, at about 2-year intervals. Sarah, Jerusha, Esther, Mary, Lucy, Timothy, Susanna, Eunice, Jonathan, Elizabeth, Pierpont, I think is the name. This was the beginning of Sarah's next great role, that of mother. Okay. Now, in 1900, she's going to reference the work of a guy named A.E. Winship, who in 1900 made a study that contrasted 2 families. So this is 170 years after the Edwardses start having children. This person is looking back on the Edwards line. He's comparing 2 families, the Edwards family and another family who all of their descendants were a drain on society. But the descendants of Jonathan and Sarah Edwards were outstanding for their contributions to society. And this is what he says of the Edwards clan. Whatever the family has done, it has done it ably and nobly, and much of the capacity and talent, intelligence, and character of the more than 1,400 of the Edwards family is due to Mrs. Edwards. By 1900, when Winship made his study, this marriage had produced 13 college presidents, 65 professors, 100 lawyers and a dean of a law school, 30 judges, 66 physicians and a dean of a medical school, 80 holders of public office, including 3 U.S. senators, mayors of 3 large cities, governors of 3 states, a vice president of the United States, a controller of the U.S. Treasury. Members of the family wrote 135 books, edited 18 journals and periodicals. They entered ministry in platoons and sent 100 missionaries overseas, as well as stocking many mission boards with lay trustees. That's unbelievable. The mark. And so no matter how much of a grind cultivating a little church is, recognize that your biggest impact here on this planet will be what you do in that little church environment. No matter how important the job may seem, how important, the next degree, or hanging out with your buddies, your biggest impact in this world will be the extent to which you cultivate a home consecrated to Christ. So it's an important topic. It's an important topic.